I left the library, bidding farewell to my colleagues, my mind as usual as I happily wander back to the apartment I shared with Carrie. My elder sister was still deep into my favorite section of the library where I enjoyed working. The shelves of detective novels full of hidden mysteries was my inspirational section. The allure of those old books would always draw me in, their pages filled with enigmatic tales waiting for me to unravel. During my early morning breaks, I would sit in the staff break room with Jen, my work friend. She always lent me her copy of the daily newspaper, as she knew my hobby of avidly scanning the pages for any crime stories. We would drink coffee. Jen would listen with a kind of proud motherly interest as I would explain to Jen how I would solve the crime. That morning, I read out to her about the police were still asking for witnesses to a hit and run from a couple of weeks ago to come forward. Poor guy, she sympathized. Hope he recovers. As our break come to an end, I washed up the cups and we would return to our respective librarian duties. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows on the quiet sitting on a large wooden trees of our neighborhood. As I neared our apartment block, I was pulled out of my daydream. I couldn't help but hope that Carrie wouldn't be in one of her moods. Our recent interactions had been strained, with underlying tensions. That's when I almost bumped into our creepy neighbor, Ray Holloway, as he scurried nervously past me, his eyes examining, making me feel uneasy. I couldn't help but hide my reaction as I whined at his creepy behavior. Carrie and I had met Ray when we visited him after he had just moved into the apartment on the same floor as ours. I had convinced Carrie, with my usual nosy curiosity, to cook him a welcoming meal on the pretense of getting to know him. That was thankfully our one and only interaction with Ray, during which he proudly showed us his vintage watch collection. I feigned interest as he told us how he Mathurla had carefully curated his collection over the years. He mentioned that he worked from home, when I showed genuine interest in the computer sitting on an old wooden desk, as a telephone salesperson, which brought a creepy smirk to his face. His job allowed him to indulge in his passion for watches. However, we didn't know much about him beyond that, and our visit left us feeling uneasy. Ray pushed through the front door of our apartment building and disappeared from sight, leaving me with a sense of curiosity that I couldn't easily dismiss. I rode the elevator to my apartment, ready to face whatever awaited me inside. Upon entering our apartment, I was greeted by Carrie, who was visibly annoyed, her irritation evident in her tone. She wasted no time in launching into her complaint. That ex-boyfriend of mine was around today asking for money, Carrie snarled, her frustration apparent. Travis or Ron? I inquired. Travis, she snapped, her voice sharp. I listened nervously, knowing that whenever Travis was around, it always upset her. Did you give him any? I asked cautiously, not wanting to delve into a subject that often led to arguments. No, didn't have any money, she replied, and there was a hint of triumph in her voice. She continued, we got into a scuffle as he tried to grab my purse. Then, as if on cue, she shifted her attention to me. Sandra, you're late again, daydreaming as usual, she huffed, crossing her arms. I told you we were having dinner early tonight. I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt, even though I was certain I wasn't late. Carrie's punctuality was a constant source of tension between us, and it seemed to extend to any male friends she had at the time. Not wanting to add to her annoyance, I hurriedly hung up my coat and joined her at the table, determined to put the awkward start of our evening behind us. We sat in relative silence. As I scraped leftovers off my plate after dinner, something in the trash bin caught my eye. I recognized it as one of Carrie's blouses, the same one she had worn that very morning. It had a missing button and a slight tear by the sleeve. When I asked Carrie about it, she told me it was from the argument she had with Travis. She recounted how in the heat of their disagreement, he had grabbed her blouse, causing it to tear and a button to pop off. I could see the pain in her eyes as she shared the memory. Later, I sat alone in my room, leaving Carrie in the lounge, engrossed in the black and white world of an old murder mystery movie playing on the television. The room was dimly lit, and the flickering light from the screen cast eerie shadows on the walls. I indulged in trying to solve the clues before the detective on screen did, my mind racing to decipher each cryptic message and hidden motive. As the plot thickened, I would find myself talking to the detective, as if he could hear my thoughts through the TV. You missed that clue, detective, I'd mutter in frustration. shaking my head as if scolding him for overlooking a vital piece of evidence. But then, as we began piecing together the puzzle, I couldn't help but lean closer to the screen, my excitement growing with each revelation. "Yes, that's it. The butler did it," I would exclaim with a sardonic laugh as I tossed my detective notebook and pen back in my bedside table drawer next to the voice recorder, feeling a sense of triumph as the pieces of the mystery fell into places. I closed the drawer. Suddenly, a sharp knock at the door disrupted the movie's eerie closing soundtrack. Startled, I turned my attention away from the screen and left my room, heading into the living room. To my surprise, 2 policemen stood in our apartment. The presence of the police in our apartment sent my heart racing with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Their stern expressions and the gravity of their presence sent shivers down my spine. The atmosphere grew heavy with tension as we faced the officers. One of the officers cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had settled over us. "Ladies, we need to talk to you about your neighbor, Raymond Holloway." "We didn't really know him," Carrie replied quickly, speaking for both of us. I looked at the other officer, my nerves making me stammer as I answered, "No. I passed him earlier today though." Feeling proud of myself for injecting some insight into the investigation, I added, "Actually, I saw him scurrying past me earlier, acting quite nervous." The officer seemed to take note of my observation. "What's he done?" I asked, my confidence growing despite the unsettling situation. "He was found dead in his apartment tonight after an anonymous call to the station," one officer informed us, dropping the bombshell that left Carrie and me exchanging shocked glances. "Was it either of you two?" one officer asked sternly. "Sorry, no." Me and Carrie answering almost together. In the days that followed, police officers came and went from Ray's apartment. I felt like I was actually in a real-life crime drama as police conducting a thorough investigation. Carrie nervously informed me that the police had even searched our apartment and taken her fingerprints. She mentioned that they might request my fingerprints as well. I couldn't help but feel a sense of intrigue and unease. "My fingerprints," I gasped with exuberance, being part of a real-life investigation, more thrilling than anything I had ever seen in the movies. As I approached our apartment block a few days later, my heart sank as I saw the sight that awaited me: Carrie, my sister, being escorted in handcuffs to a police car by officers. Panic and confusion surged within me as I rushed forward to understand what was happening. Carrie looked back at me, her eyes filled with fear. I could almost read her thoughts, screaming out her innocence. The officers explained that they needed to question her further, given the new evidence found at the crime scene. "What new evidence?" I couldn't help but blurt out, my inquiry hanging in the air, but the officer seemed to blank my question, as if unwilling to divulge any details. I felt helpless as I watched them drive away with Carrie looking back at me, lost and helpless, accused of a crime I knew in my heart there was no way she could have committed. The uncertainty of the situation weighed on me, and I knew that I had to uncover the truth. What could I do? Where would I start to clear her name and bring her back home? Determined to prove Carrie's innocence, I lay on my bed in my room, my mind racing. How would I begin? Where would Jack Stone, one of my childhood TV detective heroes, start his investigations? I'd admired detectives like him for years, and now, the opportunity to prove myself had arrived. But there was a reason I couldn't become a detective myself, despite my passion for solving mysteries. An accident had taken our parents away and left me unable to pass the physical and medical assessments required for the job because of my mental state at the time. Now, though, this was my chance to be a sleuth in my own right. I needed a starting point, a lead, anything that could crack this case wide open. And then, it hit me like a bolt of lightning. I needed to begin where it all happened, Ray's apartment, the scene of the crime. Channeling my inner sleuth, rising from my bed and headed out of my room, I couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement mixed with determination. My heart pounded in my chest with excitement as I approached closer to Ray's apartment, nervously looking around as I tested the door handle. Locked, I huffed. Undetermined, I knelt down, retrieving my amateur locking picking kit I brought of a website. My eyes opened in surprise as the lock clicked open. My chest puffed with pride, another skill to add to my sleuthing arsenal. As I crossed the threshold into his cold and daunting apartment, a sense of unease washed over me, realizing this was where it had all taken place. I glanced around the scene where Ray's life had come to a tragic end, but that wasn't going to deter me. I needed to be strong for Carrie. My tension and frustration peaked, and I exhaled forcefully, as if trying to release the pent-up anxiety that was building up inside me. The room felt unusually chilly for the time of year. I noticed signs of dusting powder everywhere, a residue from the forensic examinations that had taken place. Tentatively, I moved further into the room. It was just as sparsely furnished as during my first visit. Ray's computer equipment had been returned from the police examination and placed, unceremoniously unplugged, back on the desk. I froze, my heart skipping a beat, as I heard the sound of voices outside the apartment door. A sigh of relief washed over me as the voices faded away into another apartment. I tried the drawers in the desk, and the signs of forced entry on some of them were evident. I couldn't be sure if it had been the killer or the police, or a mixture of the two who had searched them. I assumed that each drawer had been thoroughly examined several times, but I still pulled each open and pushed them shut, hoping to find something they had missed. Suddenly, my mind flashed back to an old detective episode from a long time ago. Hidden compartments and secret drawers came to mind. With newfound determination, I searched each drawer again more thoroughly, feeling all around for some secret button, lever, or any sign of a hidden compartment. And then, it happened. Eureka! I gasped as my finger felt a hidden button deep inside one of the drawers. A small, concealed side panel popped open. I trembled as I removed the contents, a notebook, folded letters and a hard drive. I felt like I'd hit the jackpot. Full of excitement, I replacing the hard drive as I didn't have any idea what to do with it, and resealed the panel. With the notebook and letters, I rushed back to our apartment, clutching the notebook tightly in my hands. The anticipation of uncovering crucial clues was almost too much to bear. I couldn't wait to examine the notebook and see what secrets it held. To my surprise, as I opened the notebook, I realized it wasn't in any type of code or encrypted language. The ink-written pages were clear and straightforward. As I flipped through them looking at dates, names and address, the last entry in the notebook was Travis Summers. The date was recent though, only a couple of weeks ago. My heart raced as I stared at the name, my hands trembling with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Could it be Travis, Carrie's on-off boyfriend? The very person who had caused tension and turmoil in our lives? My eyes widened as I unfolding the letters and began reading the typewritten text upon them. I realized what they were. They were threatening letters revealing damaging details about people's past mistakes. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. How could Ray, a total loner who hardly ever left his apartment, have anything on Travis? The shock of this information was devastating. It opened up a world of questions and possibilities, and my mind raced with the implications. Travis had become more unstable the past few weeks. All that evening, I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. I was on edge and couldn't relax. I tossed and turned in bed, till my heavy eyes slowly blinked shut, and finally, sleep overtook me. Though my dreams were filled with a tangled web of mysteries and unanswered questions, I woke with a start, disoriented by the abrupt pounding on the apartment door. Panic seized me as I grabbed my bedrobe and rushed to the door. Spying through the door viewer Travis, I gasped, standing in the hallway. My trembling hand turned the doorknob. The sight of him left me visibly shaken, and my heart pounding in my chest, but this was a chance to ask him questions. As I slowly opened the door, "Where's Carrie?" he growled, his brutish disposition menacing as he pushed his way past me into the apartment. My voice quivered as I tried to respond. "She's not here, she's away." "Where?" His glare bore into me, and I stammered nervously. "She's at the police station answering questions." The news seemed to surprise him, his aggressive posture shifting into a nervous shuffle. "Why is she at the police station?" he inquired tentatively, the tone of his voice taking on a completely different note. "Ray," I began to explain, "our next-door neighbor, was killed the other night." The look of shock on Travis's face was undeniable. "What's Carrie got to do with his death?" He flopped down on the sofa, his earlier aggression replaced by a sense of relief and curiosity. Feeling a sudden surge of bravado, I moved closer to Travis. "Did you know Ray?" I asked, holding my voice steady. He nodded hesitantly, avoiding eye contact. Nah, is your name Travis Summers? I pressed further, trying to catch his attention. Yeah, why? He snapped back at me, his nerves evident. He jumped up and pushed his way past me to the front door. Travis, I called after him, wanting to ask more questions, but before I could continue, the door slammed shut with a force that made me fear the hinges would come off. Stunned, I lowered my body onto the sofa, my legs shaking from the encounter with Travis. Why would he deny knowing Ray and then rush off like a scared animal? I couldn't make sense of it. I took a moment to compose myself before getting up. I showered, dressed and popped my usual mix of pills to steady my nerves. Heading out to work, I couldn't help but replay the encounter with Travis in my mind. There was something he wasn't telling me, and I was determined to find out what it was. When I returned to my apartment later that evening, I was more than pleasantly surprised to find Carrie sitting on the sofa. "You're home, free," I exclaimed with joy. "On bail," she corrected me with a touch of sullenness. I rushed to hug her. In all the time we had shared the apartment, Carrie had never shown weakness, but as she lay her head on my shoulder, she began to cry softly. We held each other, and I felt a newfound sense of responsibility, and for the first time I needed to look after her. "Have you eaten?" I asked. "I haven't been able to eat, sis," she replied, wiping away tears. "Let me fix you something," I said, rising to my feet and heading to the kitchen. I quickly put together a ham salad and a mug of hot coffee. We sat at the table, but Carrie only pushed the food around her plate. "Sorry, sis, I can't eat a thing," she mumbled. "You must try, if only to keep your strength up," I urged, watching her as she took a few bites from the ham salad sandwich. Trying my hardest to sound nonchalant, I asked, "Did Travis ever mention knowing Ray?" She seemed taken aback by my question. "Not that I recall," she replied, looking puzzled. "Travis never mentioned Ray's name. Why do you ask such a weird thing?" She frowned, rose from the table, and murmured that she was tired and going to bed. "Okay," I replied, trying to keep my tone friendly. "Good night, and try to get some sleep." "Night," she replied without looking back, disappearing into her room. Left alone at the table for a while, lost in my thoughts, I dutifully washed the dinner plates and cutlery, looked around for any other little odd jobs. Satisfied, I retired to my own room. I fetched out the notebook from my bedside table, looking again at Travis's name. I retrieved the letters. I felt scared, realizing the magnitude of the danger I had placed myself in. If anyone found out I had these or even read these blackmailer's letters, what on earth could Ray have on Travis? What could Travis be into? Travis was desperate for money the other day, I recalled, but he wasn't the only name in the notebook. And then there was the anonymous caller who had reported Ray's death. But there are dozens of names written in that notebook. My heart raced as the implications of Ray's activities began to dawn on me. Blackmail, extortion, a web of secrets and lies that seemed to entangle people's lives over the past years. The revelation was beyond my wildest imagination. Too scared by the gravity, I replaced the notebook and letters. I couldn't let this consume me. I had to think rationally, try to work it all out. My hand trembled as I reached for my pills, quickly swallowing them with a cold glass of water. Before my pills kicked in, and for a moment, I felt a wave of panic and my thoughts whirled in chaos. But then, gradually, a sense of calm washed over me. I had stumbled onto something big, something dangerous, and I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. There was much work to be done, and I couldn't afford to let my own mental struggles hold me back. I took a deep breath, feeling the resolve strengthen within me. After the last few days of sleepless nights, as soon as I lay my head down on the pillow, I fell into a deep, refreshing sleep. The morning sun had already pierced through my curtains when I heard a gentle rap on my door, followed by Carrie's breezy voice. "Morning, sis," her tone which shifted since the previous night. "Coffee's hot and waiting for you on the table." I climbed out of bed, a smile of gratitude crossing my face. After a quick shower and getting dressed, I made my way to the kitchen. Carrie seemed lost in thought. "Are you okay?" I inquired, concerned. She gave me a forced smile. "Yes, I'm fine. Now get off to work and stop worrying. You'll make yourself ill." I quickly gulped down the last of my coffee, gave Carrie a hug, and headed off to work. Why did today have to be the day the library stayed open late? I sighed to Jen. "Maybe Margaret will let you off early," She knows how stressed you've been the last few days, Jen remarked, putting a comforting arm around me. Margaret was an old-school type librarian, stern and bombastic. Ever since she had arrived at the library, she often acted more like a headmistress, especially towards me it seemed, but I assumed it was because I was young and at times, vulnerable. She would always pick up on the slightest imperfections and she delighted pointing them out. And to face her to ask for time off defiantly didn't sit well with me. I shook my head. "No, it's okay," I replied, grateful for Jen's concern. "Being here will help take my mind off things." "Only if you're sure," Jen said, knowing how fearful of Margaret I was. Jen gathered up a stack of returned books to replace them back on their respective shelves. I spent the rest of the day busying myself with reshelving books, dusting, and polishing the reading tables whenever they became unoccupied, all while trying my best to avoid Margaret, who often shot me scalding glares of disapproval. As the day wore on, I would briefly sneak away, whenever Margaret was busy in her office, to the forensic section searching for answers. Unfortunately, we weren't stocked with many or even the most up-to-date books, being just a midtown library. Even my beloved detective books, which I always relied on to advise and guide me through awkward times in my life, seemed to desert me now that I was desperate for their much-needed help. Just before closing time, Margaret beckoned me into her office. "Yes, Miss Price," I responded, standing almost to attention. She always intimidated me, much like the headmaster at my last school. I would ensure I was quiet and kept out of trouble in class to avoid interactions with the headmaster. Margaret asked how I was, inquiring if all was well. I was taken aback by this change in her concerned manner. "Must have been upsetting for you, your elder sister being arrested for the murder of that poor Mr. Holloway." At first, her remark washed over me. "Did you know Ray?" I inquired. "No, not really," she responded quickly. "Only as a patron of the library when he came in to borrow books on vintage watches." She fidgeted in her chair behind her well-organized desk. "Now then," she said, composing herself, "get off home now." Good night, I replied timidly. Approaching our apartment, I felt a tinge of excitement surge through me. I rode a lift to our apartment, entered and found Carrie in the kitchen preparing our evening meal. I smiled broadly as I hung up my coat. It seemed like ages since Carrie had been busy in the kitchen. "Sit," she ordered. Her whole demeanor seemed to have changed. We sat at the table and ate the delicious welcome meal she must have spent hours preparing. She looked at me with puzzlement etched on her face. "Anything wrong?" I inquired. "Why did you think Travis knew Ray?" she asked, popping a potato into her mouth. I forked a potato and poked it into my mouth, playing for time to gather my thoughts at this unexpected inquiry from Carrie. "I found something in Ray's room," I said deliberately slowly. What, suddenly returning to Carrie of old? "When did you go in Ray's apartment?" "The day after you was arrested," quickly trying to reassure Carrie for my actions. Carrie scowled at me. "What if you had been caught?" she angrily. "Then both of us would be in jail." She wiped her mouth and dashed the napkin to the table. "I'm so mad at you," she scolded. Tears formed in my eyes. Carrie had never raised her voice like this to me before. "So what did you find?" "A notebook," I answered sheepishly as I started to play with the half-eaten sandwich on my plate. Carrie's brow crinkled. "What was in this notebook?" Nerves got the better of me and tears flowed down my face. "Names," I replied, almost embarrassed at my revelation. "Where is it now?" she inquired. "In my room," I almost sounded triumphant, then deflated as she snapped, "Go get it." I hurried to my room, retrieving the notebook from my drawer along with the letters. Carrie had moved to the sofa when I returned, the meal plates still left on the table. I sat down near her and nervously handed the notebook over to her. She thumbed through the pages of the notebook. She glared angrily at me. "You silly fool, do you know how much trouble you'll be in if anyone knows you have this?" Her voice raised in anger. "Burn it. Get rid of it." Tears still rolling down my cheeks. "Oh, stop with the waterworks," Carrie snapped. "It's evidence," I snapped back at her. "It's dangerous, that's what it is." She tried hard to lower her tone. "If Travis knows you have this, he'll go mad." Her tone heavy with empathy. Travis at the best of times was not a nice guy, I thought to myself. Carrie's tone changed. "Get rid of it, or I will," she demanded. "Have you shown them to the police?" she quizzed. "No," I replied through tears. "You are a fool," she said, shaking her head in disappointment. "All those other names too?" She dropped the notebook in my lap. She picked up the letters, glanced at a few of them. She dealt them like a playing card at me. If anyone finds out about this, anger creeping back into her voice. Get it all out of my apartment, her tone dominating and full of spite. Tears flowed from my eyes as I grabbed up the notebook and letters and sprinted full of fear to my room. Carrie was angry with me. Anyone in the notebook would kill me. Then there was scary Travis. I felt sick in my stomach as I fell back against the door, slamming it shut. I heard the front door to the apartment open and close. I sank to the floor, sobbing into my hands. I must have cried myself to sleep as I'd sat pushed against the door. I woke as Carrie banged on my door. You awake? She called from the other side of the door. Yeah, I replied, wiping tears away. I mean it, sis. Get rid of that stuff, she demanded. I was only thinking of you. I wanted to prove your innocence, I said, trying to sound in a positive way. I felt the door push against my back. I'm sitting behind the door, I called out. It almost sounded as if Carrie let out a small laugh. With what sounded sincere, I heard a quiet thanks. Get to bed, she called back. We'll deal with this in the morning. I heard her bedroom door close. I reached down to retrieve the notebook that must have fallen open as I picked it up. Price stunned me to my core. After another restless night's sleep, I rose, took a refreshing shower, and dressed. As I made my way to the lounge, I heard voices. Travis was on the sofa, Carrie was sitting at the table, and they both shot me a nervous glance as I entered. Flustered by the greeting, I strode into the lounge. You have something that belongs to me, Travis said, his tone laced with menace. I want it. Some semblance of courage seemed to surge through me as I replied, it doesn't, even surprising myself. It needs to be shown to the police. Travis aggressively jumped up, but I stood my ground as he growled, you better not. His eyes were mean and menacing as he stared at me. Hey, Travis, Carrie screamed, leave my kid sister alone. As he flopped back down on the sofa, he let out a quiet growl. Why did Ray blackmail you? I asked sternly, my arms folded, patiently waiting for his answer. For the first time, Travis seemed vulnerable. He sat with his head in his hands for what seemed like ages. Slowly, he spoke. It wasn't my fault. A tear appeared in the corner of his deep blue eyes. I had been drinking after another one of me and Carrie's fights. I drove home angry, cursing as I thumped the steering wheel. I didn't notice this old guy in the middle of the road. He stopped, looking up at me, searching my face for belief as he started his confession. I was suddenly shocked sober. I stopped the car and tried to make sense of what I'd done. His voice broke as tears flowed from his eyes. I got out of the car. There was no one about that I could see. I checked the old guy to see if I'd killed him, but he was moaning in pain. He looked at Carrie, then at me. You've got to believe me. I didn't know what to do. He wasn't dead, and I was drunk, so I took off. I looked at Carrie, who also had tears on her face. You need to tell the police, Travis. I urged him to confess. How did Carrie's button end up in Ray's apartment? I grabbed out of desperation for Carrie's purse. He replied, we got into a scuffle and I tore her blouse. Desperation of innocent heavy in his voice. I was angry and stormed out of the apartment. He stopped to clear his throat and take a gulp of coffee for his dry mouth. As I was leaving, I bumped into Ray and followed him into his apartment to beg for more time, his voice heavily labeled with sorrow. He just laughed scornfully at me, his tone suddenly filling with anger. I found Carrie's button in my hand, must have come off in my hand after the argument. He took another gulp of coffee and continued. I was angry and I threw the button at him. He just laughed and angrily spat out at me. He calmed slightly as he continued, that will cost you more, the weasel. I left his apartment still with the sound of his laughter, tears replacing his anger. Carrie came over to comfort him. I'll go with you to the station, she said softly. I didn't kill Ray, he cried into her shoulder. You best get off to work, Carrie said, looking up at me. I'll deal with Travis. I'll go with him to the station today. As I left for work, leaving them to discuss Travis's situation, I couldn't help but think about the notebook. There were names in there that stuck out. Margaret Price. What on earth could Miss Prim and Proper have done to warrant the attention of a creep like Ray arriving at the library? I hung up my coat in the staff room. Jen greeted me with her usual pleasant smile from behind the check-in counter. As I waited for my list of duties off Jen, an elderly woman approached Miss Price. Did you visit a friend the other night? I heard an elderly woman ask Margaret. I recognized the elderly woman as a bit of a busybody on the ground floor of my apartment. "What do you mean?" Margaret snapped. "I noticed you," she carried on, determined to prove she was correct. "Yes, it was you who came into my apartment block," she said determinedly. "I'm sorry, you must be mistaken. I've never been to your apartment block," she almost snapped back. "It was you," she insisted. "Then I saw you hurrying away a while later," her tone losing some of its determination as she picked up her books. "You're mistaken," Margaret said forcefully but controlled voice. The elderly woman looked puzzled at me. "Hello, Sandra," she said. "Hello, Mrs. Connors," as she recognized me. "It was her," she said quietly, putting a hand on my arm. "She thinks she's too good for around here." She gestured with her head and disappeared out the main doors. "Silly old woman," Margaret huffed, and started towards her office. "Miss Price," I called after her, "may I speak with you?" Would I be able to confront her like I had bravely done with Travis? Approached Miss Price's office. I could feel my heart racing, and my palms grew sweaty. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong, but at the same time I was torn by a conflict within myself. On one hand, I needed to confront Miss Price about visiting my apartment block, although I feared the consequences of confronting Miss Price, my authoritative and imposing boss. Thoughts swirled in my mind like a tempestuous storm. What if Mrs. Connors was wrong, and Miss Price was innocent? Could I risk my beloved job and reputation over a hunch? I recalled Mrs. Connors' accusation about Miss Price's visit to the apartment block, and it sent a shiver down my spine. My pulse quickened as I realized the gravity of the situation. Hesitation grew as I imagined the potential fallout of this imposing confrontation. I had always been the timid one, preferring to stay in the shadows rather than face any kind of confrontation head-on. But my determination to uncover the truth and prove Carrie's innocence battled with my innate fear of confrontation. Standing outside Miss Price's office, daunting images standing tearfully outside the headmaster's office, I took a deep breath, trying to gather the courage to enter the dragon's lair, knowing that once I entered, there would be no turning back. The internal conflict raged on, but I knew that the only way to find the answers I sought was to confront the formidable librarianzilla. With trembling hands, I finally entered to the eerie sound of the creaking office door, adding to forbidding setting to the grand stage for our tense confrontation that were about to play out. "Well," Miss Price snapped in her usual dismissive attitude towards me. "What do you want, Miss Price?" I began, my voice quivering slightly. "How did you know Mr. Holloway?" I asked, expecting a fiery response. "I told you," she roared, her voice dripping with disdain. "You silly girl. Why on earth would I, a respectable woman, know a man like that?" She sat upright and full of confidence behind her meticulously organized desk. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that it was just Miss Price and that I had to stay focused. I continued calmly, drawing inspiration from the detectives in the TV shows and books I admired. "Mrs. Connors wasn't the only one who saw you leaving our apartment. I was at my window enjoying the night air when I noticed you rushing away from our apartment building and driving off. I watched her closely, expecting a fierce reaction. However, all I received was silence and a deep scrutiny from her brown eyes. "I was looking for you," she mumbled nervously, but I quickly cut her off before she could continue with her lie. With a shake of my head, indicating that I didn't believe her, "I have evidence that Mr. Holloway was trying to blackmail you," I asserted confidently. "What evidence?" she inquired, trying to maintain her composure. "What could a silly girl like you possibly have?" A sense of satisfaction washed over me as I revealed my trump card. "I found Ray's notebook," I stated triumphantly. "It had your name and address, along with several other names. Plus, there were a few blackmail letters that appeared to be waiting to be sent out." "Let me have them," she demanded. I winced slightly but remained resolute. "No," I replied, trying my best to maintain my composure. "It's the only thing I have that can prove Carrie's innocence." Miss Price's resolve started to diminish as she leaned on her elbows on her desk. "Why was he blackmailing you?" Puzzlement heavy in my tone. "What could Ray possibly know about a stuck-up bitch like you?" I had finally let out my venom towards her. She was taken aback at my attitude. She tried to hide the tears behind her hands. "Tell me before I take the notebook to the police." A whimper sounded from behind her hands. "Ray," she slowly began, "was one of my husband's." "What?" I exclaimed. Husband, this shocking revelation wasn't at all what I expected. You of all people must know how I strive for perfection. Yes, I answered, still shaken from this revelation. She lowered her hands from her face, looked at the window as if gathering strength to continue. Ever since I can remember, I expected perfection not only from myself but anyone else. She began to fiddle with a loose paperclip on her desk. As she continued to look away from me, my first marriage was excellent to a point. She glanced down at her hands, but he just wasn't good enough. I soon moved on, found someone else. Flabbergasted, I sat down on the very uncomfortable wooden chair. Miss Price seemed to keep it to make her staff as uncomfortable as possible. What happened then? My tone almost softens as I listen intently. She nervously continued, we got married and lived happily for a couple of years, but I soon became bored. Same thing day after day. Then a new exciting bloke took my attention. Puzzled, but I had to ask, you got divorced? She shook her no with embarrassment. I just moved on and got married to the next one. She looked at me solemnly, and to make things worse, emptying any joint bank accounts we had, she stopped and glanced away. I'm just as selfish. Always expect and demand my own way. Where does Ray come into this? Pushing for answers. He was someone I fell for, especially as I thought he was well off. She tossed the paperclip aside. After I discovered his way of making money, seemed exciting at first. Blackmail, I interjected. One of his ways. She responded, things got a bit too hot for me, so I ran away, starting another new life. She sighed heavily. I married another 3 times, but was never met up to my expectations. She dusted some imaginary dust off her desk with the back of her hand. I resorted each time to a new name. After a few years, I accidentally bumped into Ray. He started almost immediately demanding money from me. She raised a hand to her head. What money I did have was soon gone. She sighed and continued on. One of the men I had married had been a head libation, so I talked my way into a job. I had forged papers. She let out a nervous laugh. Forgery was one thing. Ray always remarked how good I was at that kind of thing. She almost sounded proud of her deception. In a city and a few states away, I thought working in a library he wouldn't find me there. Miss Price wiped away tears with her lacy handkerchief. I sat still and quiet, listening intently to her unraveling life story. She continued, but he found me. She sighed with disappointment and demanded even more money off me. So again I moved away, her voice trembling. I used my forged document to get this job. Wasn't anyone suspicious? I asked. I'd done a good job with the document. Shame started creeping into her voice as she relayed, and the interviewer was just another man to be used, seduced, and discarded. She put her head in her hands, sobbing quietly. This was a revelation I defiantly wasn't prepared for. Then Ray showed up a few months ago, and my nightmare was starting all over again. As he demanding more money, she spoke through tears. Why did you visit Ray? I inquired, concerned for the answers. I visited Ray to beg him to leave me alone. She paused for a moment, but he just laughed. I begged him. I didn't have any more to give him, anger tinging her voice. He made me so angry. As he stood close to me, I could smell his cheap aftershave. Realizing what she was about to confess to me, she gulped sharply. There is one thing. Ray smirked at me, her voice heavy with disgust. I was so angry and disgusted how smarmy he was acting with. I just wanted him to get away from me, so I pushed him, her confusion bearing down hard on us both. I didn't mean to shove him so hard, but all that pent-up anger had built up towards him. He fell back, hitting his head hard on the corner of that stupid desk. He had hard drive hidden along with that notebook. I assume you didn't find that when you searched his apartment? I think I might have, I said. I didn't think anything of it though. She shrugged and continued, when he didn't move, I was terrified. I ran from his apartment. Sounded relieved as she continued. I passed a call box and reported the accident anonymously. At least she had done something right, I thought. What will you do now? She asked. I don't know, I replied, slowly getting up and moving towards the office door in freedom and not wishing to give my secret away. As I stepped out of the office, I heard Miss Price say, "You're smarter than you look," pulling the door closed behind me. Relief washed like a tide wave over me. As I strode away from the office, I retrieved the voice recorder from my pocket and pressed the stop button. The next day, after gathering up the evidence and the voice recorder, I made my way to the police station with a mix of nervousness and determination. Approached the front desk. "I need to speak with the detective in charge of my sister's case," I told the officer on duty. A short wait later, I found herself in a small interview room. sitting across from Detective Anderson. Taking a deep breath, I placed the notebook and the voice recorder on the table. "Detective, I have some evidence that I believe will clear my sister, Carrie, from any involvement in Ray Holloway's death." Detective Anderson raised an eyebrow by my revelation and leaned forward. "Go on," he said in a gruff voice. I explained how I had found Ray's notebook with the names and addresses of potential blackmail targets, including Miss Price. I said as detail on my conversation with Miss Price, telling the detective how she had confessed to her involvement in multiple marriages and her history of being blackmailed by Ray. The detective listened, occasionally making notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair studying me intently. Eventually he sighed. "This is quite the revelation. If your story and the evidence check out, it could change the direction of the case." I felt a glimmer of hope but maintained my composure. I carefully slid the voice recorder toward the detective. "I have a recording of my conversation with Miss Price. I think it'll confirm everything I've just told you." Detective Anderson nodded, picked up the recorder, and listened carefully to the recorded confession. After a few moments, he looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "This appears to be genuine, and it corroborates your account. I'll need to verify the information and speak with Miss Price." Over the next several days, the police conducted their investigation, and it became clear that my evidence was valid. Miss Price's confession, combined with the evidence in Ray's notebook, led to a significant breakthrough in the case. Carrie was released from custody, and the charges against her were dropped. The cloud of suspicion that had hung over her began to dissipate. The truth had prevailed. "Thanks to my courage and determination," Carrie remarked to me with pride. With Carrie's name cleared and the focus of the investigation shifting to Miss Price, the police began to look into the hit-and-run incident. Travis was eventually charged with leaving the scene of an accident and failing to render aid to hit-and-run victim after the collision. During Travis's trial, Travis's legal defense team argued that although he had panicked after the accident but eventually owned up to the accident, however, he was found guilty and sentenced to a period of probation and community service. "I have a new outlook on life and even found myself an apartment." Carrie had a new person to fuss over. Travis moved in with soon after I moved out. Carrie promising to curtail his reckless lifestyle and turn his life around. I even applied for the vacant head librarian job, encouraged by Jen and the other members of staff. As I sat in the office feeling so proud of myself, I still shared my break times. Jen